Guys, I got my time mixed up. I thought it was another time. But there we are. Let's start our webinar. Welcome to the PIDE webinar. I'm Nadeem Al-Haq. We start the webinar now. Today we've got a very interesting topic, and this is a webinar joint with the World Bank, which I'm very happy that we're collaborating with the World Bank. We like collaboration. We like collaborating with everybody. So this is wonderful. So let's do a webinar on Pakistan's tariff bias, anti-export or anti-consumer. I think it's a very important topic because exports, as you know, has been a preoccupation of Pakistan from day one. We've always wanted to export more, but we've never succeeded. Our export GDP ratio has not quite grown. We've always been stuck at about close to, I think, something 20% or roughly. Less than that in terms of export, no, closer to 10% in terms of export GDP ratio. And despite our efforts, all our efforts, despite having a huge setup for increasing exports, something like 100, 150 commercial officers in every embassy, and Trade Development Authority and the whole Ministry of Commerce doing nothing else but pushing exports and giving subsidies, our exports still remain stuck. They don't grow much. So we're very happy to see that the World Bank has done some work on this. And so let's see what they say. We've got a great panel. We got Dr. Gonzalo Barella from the World Bank. He's a senior economist of the World Bank in the Pakistan office. He's in Pakistan and has been doing a lot of good work on exports, writing about it in newspapers, etc. So it's a happy occasion that he's here to help us think this through. And we've got Ahmed Fasih, regional trade office, regional trade policy advisor in Riyadh. Yeah, okay. We'll find out what that is. I'm afraid I don't know what that is, but nevertheless. And we've got Dr. Asad Malik, Chief Executive Officer of Pakistan Business Council. Dr. Safdar Suhail, now Executive Director of capacity of Social Protection Resource Center in Islamabad, but formerly of the Commerce Ministry, knows commerce well. So let's begin. Dr. Gonzalo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nadeem, and I also really value this collaboration with PIDE. But without further ado, let's start with the topic that brings us today, the anti-export bias of import duties, anti-export or anti-consumer. And I will argue that it's mostly an anti-export bias that we have imposed by the import duty structure that Pakistan has. So that this problem of low export growth in Pakistan is related to, it's self-inflicted. It's related to its tariff structure. So I will have a presentation that I would like to share with you. So give me a second that I share screen. Great. Okay, so I'll start then. And just in case people get bored and want to disconnect earlier, I will start with my main message right away. And my main message is that import duties are export taxes in disguise. So really, in theory, they are levied on import. In theory and in practice, they are levied on imports, but they have an unintended consequence that is curbing exports, that is discouraging exports. And let me tell you how I'm planning to structure this presentation. I'm going to first talk a little bit about how import duties are structured in Pakistan and elsewhere. And then I will argue why the structure of import duties in Pakistan is a problem. And that will bring me to the anti-export bias story. And then I will say a few things about what can be done about it. So let's start with a bit of background on import duties. First thing that needs to be considered is that import duties account for a sizable share of tax revenues in Pakistan. So if one thinks about the structure of tax collection across countries, there is one regularity that holds pretty well, pretty tightly. That is, as countries grow rich, they collect less taxes at import stage, and they collect more taxes in the form of excise, in the form of income tax, etc., etc. So what you have there in the slide is basically a scatter plot in which you have all countries for which we have data and the share of taxes they collect from trade taxes, so basically tariffs and other related import duties. And you have on the horizontal, basically the level of development to the country, level of GDP per capita. And what you can see is this negative relation. As countries grow, they collect less taxes on trade. And what you also see is that Pakistan is a little bit above what we would expect, given its level of development in terms of how much they collect from trade taxes. Basically, they collect about 16% of total taxes come from import duties. That is customs duties, regulatory duties, and additional customs duties. On top of that, there is the sales tax, but the sales tax falls both on imported and domestic goods. So take that out, you end up with about 16% of taxes come from import taxes. Now, the other thing that is important to say is that comparatively, these import duty rates are high in Pakistan. And there are several stories about this. And sometimes one sees different comparisons in which Pakistan doesn't do so badly. But actually, one needs to take into consideration that Pakistan not only has tariffs, but it also has regulatory duties and additional customs duties. Tariffs are about, on average, 12%. Regulatory and additional customs duties are an extra 8%. So all in all, on average, we have import duties of 20% that brings Pakistan to on the top of the list of countries in terms of the protection they grant through import. And the other feature that is quite marked in Pakistan is the fact that there is cascading in import duties. So cascading means what? Cascading means that import duties are higher for consumer goods and lower for intermediates and raw materials. And this story sounds reasonable, but I will argue that actually this cascading is at the heart of the anti-export bias story. So the intention of the cascading is to promote industrialization in the country. So you allow firms to import the intermediates and raw materials at relatively low rates, but you protect them on the final good. You give them high protection on the final good. Basically, what that ends up doing is giving extremely high effective protection to Pakistani producers. To calculate effective rates of protection, what we look at is at how much a sector adds in terms of value, and so how much value added there is as a share of their output, and how much do they pay in terms of duties for intermediates, raw materials, but also by how much they are protected on their final good. And once you put these three pieces of information together, value added over output, taxes on raw materials and intermediates, and tariffs on final good, what you see is extremely high rates of effective protection for many of the manufacturing sectors in Pakistan, in many cases well above 100%. So this effective protection is basically doing what? It is inducing firms in Pakistan to sell in the domestic market where they are facing this effective protection. And with this, I will go to the second point of the presentation, that is, why is this a problem? And this the heart of the anti-export bias story. And so what import duties do is they basically tilt incentives towards domestic market orientation because they reduce the profits of exporting relative to the profits of selling domestically. And this happens in Pakistan, it happens everywhere. I mean, this story of the anti-export bias of tariffs is something that was brought up in 1920 by by an economist called Ava Lerner. So it's not something I'm bringing it up, right? It's a long-standing idea. But there are two ways you can think about tariffs and export competitiveness, right? Or two channels. One channel is the channel that operates through imported inputs. And one of the things that we see is, again, in a cross country type of setting, is if you put all countries together in terms of their export growth and their input tariff incidence, so how much they charge of tariffs on intermediate inputs, what you see is the more they charge on tariffs on intermediate inputs, then the less they grow their exports. And basically this happens because intermediate inputs are crucial to increase your competitiveness. You need to have access to a wide set of intermediates to be able to produce something competitively and sell it internationally in a competitive way. I mean, the typical example for Pakistan is what is happening with, for example, synthetic fibers. So if apparel producers have access to the widest range of textile fibers, then they're going to be more competitive in international markets. If they don't, because there are high import duties on these intermediates, then they're going to be restricted in what they can do, and they're going to be restricted in how much they can sophisticate their export offer. So I did some work on this issue of tariffs on intermediate inputs and competitiveness. And the key channel through which these two things are related is the channel of productivity. So basically what we saw when we analyzed what happens when tariffs on intermediate inputs, or what we call upstream tariffs, increase, what we see is the productivity of firms decreases, right? And the interesting thing is that, and that's what you see basically in this chart, in which you see the effects, whether they're positive or negative or around zero. So if the effect is touching that red line there, it means the effects are around zero. And if the bars are below the red line, it means that the effects are detrimental, so that the increases in tariffs reduce productivity. And what we see is something quite interesting, that is domestic firms, so firms that are focused in the domestic market, suffer from high import duties. Now, if you focus on exporters, the large exporters don't suffer so much from import duties on intermediates, because they have access to refund schemes that FBR will pay. Now, we all know that these refund schemes that FBR is supposed to have in place are schemes that have problems. So the refunds for exporters on their intermediate input duties they pay are complex. They take a lot of time to be actually refunded. And so what we see is that for small exporters, the negative productivity effect is still there, meaning these small exporters really struggle with the FBR system to refund their duties paid on intermediates. The larger firms handle it better, right? So the key takeaway of this is you need to improve the duty refund scheme, yes, but this is not going to be a substitute for an across-the-board tariff reduction if you want to help firms become more competitive by reducing their costs through lower tariffs on intermediates. And another piece of work we did on this topic was we looked at what happens when you eliminate these duties. And the China-Pakistan Free Trade Agreement provides us a good example. And I started working on this a couple of years ago when there was a lot of debate about the usefulness of this free trade agreement, and there was a lot of debate in the press about how the bilateral trade deficit between China and Pakistan was evidence of the agreement not being good for Pakistan. Now, what you see when you start looking at the data a little bit more carefully is that what happened with this agreement was that there was an increase in import penetration for some key inputs from China because the tariffs were lower, and so firms were buying more inputs from China. And those sectors in which there was an increase in import penetration of inputs from China were sectors that actually did better in terms of export competitiveness, not necessarily with China, but with third markets. So a typical example is compressors for refrigerators. So there was an increase in imports of compressors from refrigerators from China, and there was an increase of exports of refrigerators to Afghanistan. So these refrigerators they fabricated and they made in Pakistan were not sold back to China, they were sold somewhere else. But that's still an increase in export competitiveness associated with an increased access to intermediates coming from the rest of the world. Now, this is a story that is a little bit, I would say, less controversial. So I think if you talk to firms out there, they would say reducing tariffs on intermediate inputs, on raw materials, and on capital equipment is a good thing, right? Nobody would argue against that, I would assume. Now, there is a second part of the anti-export bias story that has to do with what is happening with the tariffs on final goods. And my point is, tariffs on final goods also need to fall if you want to reduce the anti-export bias of tariff policy. And we see the evidence across countries. So again, here you have a scatter plot. In the horizontal axis, you have the output tariff levels across countries. On the vertical, you have the growth in exports. And again, you see a negative relation. But the argument is relatively straightforward. And I'm going to give you an example. That is the example of a bicycle. So instead of looking at a scatter plots with many points that perhaps, hide many things, well, let's think more practically. So take a normal bicycle. And let's say that the international price for the bicycle is $100. And in Pakistan, the import duties on bicycles are 52%. So that means that the price at which a domestic Pakistani firm can sell this bicycle here in Pakistan to Pakistan's consumer is $152 without being outpriced by international competition, right? Because the international competitor will produce at $100, but will have to face the import duties of 52. So the Pakistani producer can sell in Pakistan a bicycle for up to $152. But if this same Pakistani producer wanted to export the bike, he would only get $100. So the 52% import duty is basically pushing this producer in Pakistan to sell this bike in Pakistan rather than go through the hassle of exporting that is complicated on its own right and getting $100. So this is, I would say, the main, conceptually the main point of the argument. And it goes back to this chart that I was presenting before. That is, if you have very or relatively low tariffs on intermediates and raw materials, but higher on consumer goods, you're inducing your firms to sell domestically because domestically they are protected, right? And even in South Asia, on average, if you take South Asia average without Pakistan, that South Asia is a highly protected region, you see that they do have higher tariffs on consumer goods, but the gap is not that large. So the large gap that you see in Pakistan implies large effective protection, implies a large incentive for firms not to export, but to sell domestically. Now, a good example of reform is the example of Vietnam. So in the case of Vietnam, what happened was that there was a sharp trade liberalization in 2008. And at the same time, you have, and the typical fear with a large trade liberalization is, well, what is going to happen with imports and what is going to happen with the current account deficit? And what ended up happening was that actually Vietnam integrated dramatically into the global marketplace, and its global market share increased from about 0.3% in 2005, the global market share, the export market share, from about 0.3% in 2005 to about 1.1 in 2019. So in 2019, Vietnam exports about $1.1 out of $100 the world exports. Whereas at the same time, Pakistan's global market shares declined. And basically, you don't see large current account imbalances. You see the opposite. You see actually imports grew, but also exports grew. So you see balances overall. Pakistan, on the other hand, export orientation over time has actually declined. Nadim was mentioning this at the beginning. In 2000, it was 15%. Today, it's 10%. So the country is more inward looking. And no surprise, it's more inward looking because tariffs are extremely high, and high tariffs have encouraged firms to sell domestically. And these high tariffs haven't actually curbed imports at all. Because if you see Pakistan for the last 20 years, for about 16 out of the 20 last years, run current account deficits. So if the objective of the import duty was to curb imports, they didn't deliver on that objective. Why? Because you have, yes, the tariff on the final good high, but the tariff on the intermediate raw material is much lower. So firms have incentives to import their intermediates and sell domestically. So they get the imports, but they don't deliver on their exports. So let me go into what to do about it. And before I get into what to do about it, let's see a little bit on what is it that they have been doing. And so for this, I will compare what happened. So the last Finance Act in Pakistan brought some tariff changes. So what you have here is the before and after the last Finance Act. So the initial in fiscal year 20, the final in fiscal year 21, and you have the changes. And the first, I would like to focus on the first 4 lines there. There is the customs duty, CDE, the regulatory duty, RD, additional customs duty, and the total. And if you just look at the total, 21.67% moved to 20.99%. Very, very timid change. Not much change in terms of tariff reductions. But the particularly problematic thing is if you actually go and look by type of product instead of looking at the average. And so if you look at by type of product, what you see is that the large changes actually happened in industrial supplies and in capital goods. So again, in principle, one says, okay, that reduces cost for firms, true, but it also increases the anti-export bias of tariff policy. So no change in tariffs on food and beverages, and very timid changes on consumer goods that have extremely high tariffs of 34.7% on average. So the tariff rationalization initiative is, on the one hand, something commendable. They are trying to reduce tariffs, but on the other hand, they are forgetting about reducing the tariff on the final good, and therefore forgetting about this anti-export bias problem that is out there. So let me share some ideas on what I think should be done. And the first thing is introduce simplicity, transparency, and predictability in tariff policy making. And in particular, I would say here, stay away from approaches that are extremely sector specific. So if you go for sector specific approaches, you bias anything that is new. So if there is any effort to diversify, that effort is not going to be prized, instead it's going to be penalized. Why? Because any sector specific approach is going to focus on the sectors that have bargaining power to go and negotiate for tariff reductions on their intermediates and raw materials. Also because firms need transparency and they need predictability, so they can't change their business plan on every Finance Act. They need to have a plan for the next 5 years, know what is going to happen with tariffs so they can adjust. Second is, yes, reduce import tariffs on inputs, but gradually also reduce the tariffs on final goods too. That will reduce the anti-export bias. And by the way, that will also help to attract the right type of FDI, right? So the Vietnam story is not only a story of tariffs, right? So I'm not obsessed with tariffs. So I understand the Vietnam success story is also a story of many other things that happen. But one of those things is FDI. The thing is, if you have high tariffs, you're going to attract the FDI that wants markets in the country, not the FDI that wants efficiency-seeking type of platforms. So you're not going to attract the firms that want to come to Pakistan to set an export base here, because the tariffs give them such high profits by selling domestically that you will get those that want to exploit the domestic market. Third, simplify the process for accessing duty exemption schemes for exporting firms. This system is complicated. Everybody, I would say everybody agrees on that, but there is evidence showing that it's particularly complicated for small firms that cannot avail because the administrative costs are so low. And fourth, introduce evidence-based and performance-linked support to new exporters. So stay away from sector-specific subsidy schemes, but mainly stay away from any subsidy scheme that uses public funds, taxpayers' money, that is not subject to an impact evaluation, that we don't know if it works or doesn't work to deliver on its objectives. So take stock of the incentive schemes you have, start monitoring, evaluating, or doing impact evaluations, and focus on those that work and phase out those that don't. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but if I have 5 more minutes, I wanted to touch upon Nadim's point from our previous interaction, and this story of whether tariffs are introduced an anti-export bias and an anti-consumer bias was something that Nadim prompted, saying actually they introduce an anti-consumer bias. And I want to say, yes, you're right, but they introduce both things. Right? So it's not that they introduce one and not the other, they introduce both things. And I wanted to share some preliminary evidence that we have when we looked at what are tariffs doing to consumption, to the consumer bundle, and particularly what is doing to the poor. So they do introduce an anti-consumer bias. And I just wanted to again share this slide in which we have on food and beverages, no change. So if you think, and on consumer goods, very little change. So if you really want to think about consumers, consumers are paying much higher prices than they should be by virtue of import duties that are on the verge of 30 to 35%. Now, the problem also is that these import duties are actually anti-poor. So they are a very regressive tax. And what this chart shows is basically the distributional impact of import duties. So as a share of total expenditure by the level of income of the household, right? How much you pay in import duties. And what you see is that the poorest households, so those that are in the first deciles, pay much more in import duties than the richer deciles. And this is by virtue of the fact that the poor consume more in terms of goods and less in terms of services, right? That don't have tariffs applied. And this is regardless of how you measure the tariffs. If the statutory or the effective, the message is still the same. So the poor face almost, so those in the poorest decile of the distribution of income face almost double the burden of import duties than the richest, the ones in the richest decile. So these tariffs don't only introduce an anti-export bias, they are also anti-poor. So I will finish with this. Import duties in Pakistan haven't delivered on their objective. One can think of 3 objectives: to collect revenues. Largely, they promote smuggling. Perhaps collecting revenues is the only one in which they sort of deliver. To curb imports, they haven't delivered on curbing imports because they stimulate firms to get intermediate inputs and raw materials from abroad at relatively low tariffs because they have the protection domestically and these firms on export. And to protect domestic consumers, the other objective also hasn't delivered on that because they keep firms away from export markets that are key platforms for growth. So why? Because they are a tax, implicit and powerful tax on exports, and because in this day and age, we live in a world of global value chains. Firms integrate with global markets through international production networks. And what Tariff do is they introduce a lot of sand in the wheel of these international production networks. And so they discourage productivity, knowledge transfers, reducing scope for sophisticating Pakistan's exports. And they are a burden for the poor more than they are a burden to the rich. So they are a regressive tax contribute to high food prices. So if we want to boost export competitiveness and we want to support domestic firms, perhaps we need to start thinking about a different way of doing it than using tax. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you. This is music to my ears. I appreciate that. I must say that this has been a long, long debate in Pakistan. I should mention a few names here. Our own A.R. Kamal in PIDE made many arguments such as this in papers. Ijaz Ghani did that. Zafar Mahmood did that. Manzoor Saab, now in Islamabad, a senior fellow at PIDE, he's been making such arguments for a long time. Unfortunately, the government is not receptive to these arguments. So perhaps your coming on board might make them more receptive. But I think two things that you might also need to apply further here, which increases both the anti-export bias as well as the anti-poor biases, are desire to keep the exchange rate appreciated, which also acts like a tariff. So I think we've done a paper in PID recently on a 5-currency crisis where exchange rate perpetually appreciates, and then we go in for a currency crisis, and then so this adjustment, this uncertainty of the exchange rate and the bias towards overvaluation also acts like a tariff, and it also acts disproportionately on industry as well as the poor. And the second thing is a creeping capital controls. I'm a child of capital controls, and I remember that we never saw a dollar bill, and that when I left the country to study, I had a £5 note under my socks because you had to be searched at the airport, and how when money had to be sent to me by my parents had to come through the informal channel, how I used to read comic books because they were banned in the country, so I had to get them through the informal channel. So, yeah, it does bias against poor kids like myself too, who wanted to read comic books. So it's a very valuable chain. However, I shall not go on with my stories. I shall bring in, we'll discuss this later, but let me bring in Mr. Ahmed Fassi from DIA. Mr. Fassi, over to you. Let's see how you react to Gonzalo's presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nadeem. First of all, let me explain this. That it's DAI. We are implementing partners of USAID's project, which is Pakistan Regional Economic Integration Activity. And I have been seconded there by Ministry of Commerce before joining this project 2 years ago. I had served in Ministry of Commerce in the...
What does DIA mean?
Development Alternatives Incorporated. It's a US-based firm. So before joining here, I had served in the foreign trade wing of Ministry of Commerce, and that basically dealt with European Union and made efforts to secure better market access for Pakistan there. I'm glad to see that Mr. Ehsan Malik is also there from Pakistan Business Council.
Ministry of Commerce official is contracted to a US contractor.
No. Ministry of Commerce had sent me on secondment. They just want me to connect that project with a trade. Am I audible to everybody?
You're very audible. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Right. So basically, Gonzalo has summed up the case very well. I would not like to go into repetition, but just a few points that I've been thinking about is that these high tariffs actually that Pakistan maintains and very complicated, tariffs in the form of custom duties and then additional custom duties and regulatory duties over and above them reflect lack of our confidence on exporting sector to turn things around. And I totally agree with Gonzalo that this policy unfortunately has not delivered on its stated objectives either. And the sectors that we have sort of protected over the years with the hope that they will graduate one day and they will become more competitive globally or regionally, unfortunately have not really delivered on that. So as I see it, there are three ways in which import tariffs have really hurted or impacted our export sector adversely. One is that because of our reluctance to bring tariffs down and enter into freer trading arrangements with other countries and region, because with the fear that we won't be able to protect our industry, has increased our reliance on unilateral market access arrangements, which in the first place are very limited. And secondly, you see, it has also kind of, ensured, it has also kind of made an impact in a sense that our exports have remained concentrated in very few sectors. I'll tell you how. Pakistan has a duty-free access in European Union, and we got that in 2014. Before that, our exports to European Union were 23% of our total exports. Today, our dependence on that market has increased manyfold, and it's now about 34% of our exports are going to EU. And it will become clear to you what I'm trying to tell you when I give you an example of Bangladesh, which had been a beneficiary of a unilateral access in European Union for a very long period of time. And as a result, what has happened is that European Union remains its major export destination. Its exports are not diversified in other international markets. More than 60% of its exports go to European Union. More than 60% of its exports are also concentrated in textile and apparel sector only. And I see that with our increased reliance on this unilateral access, same thing could be happening to Pakistan in the long run. And secondly, what's wrong with these schemes is that you see, without undertaking necessary reforms, your exports remain vulnerable. These systems are vulnerable because those countries are bound to change these schemes over a period of time. The present GSP Plus scheme will be revised in 2023, with United Kingdom not there in European Union, which had been the greatest support for Pakistan. I think we will find very few people supporting the case for Pakistan to retain market access in EU beyond 2023. So that's really very important for us to consider. You see, now we see countries are exhibiting confidence, more and more confidence, the developing countries, and they're opening up to the rest of the world. I'll give you the example of Bangladesh, which has recently announced that it will renounce its least developed country status to graduate into developing country. And what that means is that Bangladesh will no longer have unilateral market access, enhanced duty-free market access in a European Union and other developed countries. And it has announced that it is now ready to undertake more free trade agreements with other countries, which will entail reciprocal concessions. While it will gain enhanced market access in those markets, it will also allow more imports from those countries into Bangladesh. We are seeing that Cambodia is opening up now. I don't, Gonzalo has already talked about Vietnam. Vietnam has, gone beyond us. What I'm seeing is that in coming years, countries like Bangladesh and Cambodia would be outpacing us and really increasing their exports exponentially unless we start to do something right. And I think while we cannot really do away with tariffs completely, it's very important that we rationalize and simplify them. We make, but it doesn't really make any sense that the kind of tariff dispersions that we have within sectors. When I was studying import regime on textile raw materials and input goods, there are 16 different combinations of custom duties, regulatory duties, and additional custom duties on that. why on earth would anyone come in Pakistan and enter into joint ventures with local Pakistani manufacturers or set up a plant in Pakistan when they cannot import raw materials or intermediary goods with ease from regional countries, when they do not have market access for their final products in the region or beyond. So I really see that with this policy of import substitution, I would say that very carefully. We cannot expect different results in 2020 than what we had in many years ago. So if you just see that Pakistan's exports, even in textile, have remained predominantly cotton-based exports. Our textile apparel exports are predominantly cotton-based, and this is the category which is shrinking globally. And our unfortunately mix is the same today than as it was 10 years ago. And countries like Vietnam and countries like Cambodia are changing that mix very fast. And the demand for that product is also textile apparels, which are based on man-made fiber and staple fibers, is growing in international markets. And we are not able to focus on that because we maintain very high import duties on this raw material as well. So and then I've also seen that these concessions, these protections in form of import duties are there are no KPIs for that. You can never ask those sectors that what are we getting in return for that? Are you paying more wages to workers because we are protecting you? Are you giving better conditions for workers? Are you doing something to improve, about your emissions and everything? We have no way of knowing it, and we have no way of knowing how long we would continue to stay disconnected for the benefit from the world, for the benefit of the very few. So I would conclude here and pass this over to our next honorable participant.
Thank you,
So if there are any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Fasisa. We'll bring you in with questions later. Of course, we always have the speakers first and questions later. There is a very good analysis of how the system is working and how the international arena is changing. I was just looking at a paper from A.R. Kamal in 1987, calculating effective protection rates and making roughly similar points. So this debate is a long-standing debate, and somehow the debate has not really got going. I mean, it's always kind of, we have one session debate, never really takes off. So it's good that we have an industry representative here from PBC, Mr. Hassan Malik. Mr. Hassan Malik is a well-known professional. He's been the CEO of Unilever and a very well-respected business professional. He's running PBC for a while. Business. Hassan Malik sir, over to you.
Okay, Ji, thank you very much and giving me an opportunity to talk on this very important subject. I would actually first start by saying what is it that Pakistan needs, right? I think foremost, if you think about it, Pakistan needs jobs, employment, right? Exports, imports, etc., they may be a means to getting it, or certainly exports can be means of getting it, but primarily you need, first of all, jobs that lead to disposable incomes, which lead to consumption, which then lead to production and various other things. Yeah. So you can't start with the end here and say miraculously we want consumption to take place, but we are not bothered about jobs. Yeah. Now, if you want to create jobs, obviously, ideally, you should be creating it in export-oriented industries. But equally, for a country of 210 or 214 or 15 million people, the domestic market is also very important. So you need to be able to fulfill at least your basic demand or demand for basic goods by producing them locally. So let me take an example. Shoes. 15 years ago, there were hardly any imports of shoes into Pakistan. Today, there are hardly any local production of shoes. It's incidental. We make chappals basically, or we make Peshawari chappals, or these flip-flops that you use in the bathroom, essentially. I'm slightly exaggerating to make the point, but this is the sea change that has happened. Yeah. Now, so the question is, what is it that we need to achieve, right, in order to generate jobs? And why is it that industry seeks cascading tariffs, and why is it that Pakistan Business Council, for example, advocates cascading tariffs? Now, I must say that before I come to that, I have to agree that not only are tariffs high in Pakistan, tax rates are also very high in Pakistan. Not only do the tariffs subject a certain section of society to a high incidence of cost, but when it comes to taxes, it also subjects disproportionately the few who pay taxes with a very heavy burden. So just a case in point, manufacturing represents 20% of the GDP, pays 56% of the total taxes. Yeah. So this is the extent of reliance on the few. We have not been able to broaden our tax base, and therefore we continue to rely on easy picks. And imports are very easy to tax because things are coming from ports, and you can given some sense of honesty and propriety, you can tax them as they come in. So it's an easy way to do that. But I totally agree that the tariff rates are high and they need to come down, and eventually the tariff rates on the finished goods or consumer goods, as you call it, or ready to consume or ready to use goods should also come down. But there is a journey and there is a time and evolution that is required to do that. Why do I say that? For about 10 years, we did not have adequate energy. So what happened to our industry? The industry of Pakistan basically deindustrialized. And for the size of our country and the evolution of our development, we cannot afford to lose jobs in manufacturing. The growth of manufacturing and the growth of GDP for a country like Pakistan is exceedingly closely correlated, and I can share those numbers later. Yeah. So the country has been deindustrializing, the country has been losing jobs, so no wonder we don't actually have the disposable incomes in any case to consume. And and if you do not rectify and you do not encourage domestic manufacturing, you will find that and somehow miraculously you are able to create the means of consumption. That consumption will come of imported products. So our economy is heavily consumption oriented. As much as 80% of our total GDP comes from consumption, and there's a very high reliance on imports. This is the reason why we also have recurring external account crisis. And for 22 times we've been to the IMF. In fact, we've been in an IMF program for more years since independence than we've been out of it. Yeah. So there are some fundamental reforms that are required. Now let me come back to manufacturing. Manufacturing is a combination of materials. Some of them are imported, some of them are local, but there's a conversion cost involved. Energy plays a varying role depending on what we're talking about. It can be as little as 5 to 10%. It can be as much as 20 to 25% of the total cost mix. On the domestic industry, the burden of energy costs is 25% higher than the global or the regional norms. So if you look at the rate at which the cascading import tariffs have been introduced in the last year, you find, and Gonzalo shared those figures, there was a minimal impact in the overall reduction of import tariffs, 0.8% to 1.11%. But if energy cost alone represents 25% of your manufacturing cost, and that is 25% higher, that is actually more than the impact that the positive benefit that may have been created as a result of the cascading tariffs. So this is one of the main reasons why I believe that cascading tariffs have to be brought in. They have to be targeted, they can't be general. They have to be targeted on raw materials that are not available in Pakistan. And they have to be, of course, also on intermediate items that are again not being produced in Pakistan. Eventually, yes, I agree that the import duties on finished goods must also come down. So, at the same time, I firmly believe that you cannot have indefinite protection. Anybody, any sector that believes that they should enjoy indefinite protection are living in a fool's world. It will not happen, and it should stop happening if it is happening. And I also believe that there cannot be unconditional incentives given to any sector, whether it is export or import substitution. So import substitution on a sustainable basis and on a competitive basis makes a huge amount of sense for a country where there are 2 million people becoming of employable age every year. If you don't offer them meaningful employment, they're going to be on your streets creating trouble for you. There are 5 million unemployed, and this is before COVID. And of course, post-COVID, we have significantly more people who are unemployed. So I want to leave enough time for question and answers. I want to just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan Sab. Thank you very much. There you have it. We've got the competing employment, we've got the government, we've got manufacturing, all for competing interests, but we always tend to go for not the second, the third, or the fourth, fifth best. So there's a problem here, we try and tackle it here, then there's a problem here, we tackle it here. So we're in a mess, and everybody knows that. I was just looking at another paper by Ijaz Ghani and then by myself as well on effective protection rates. This point has been made, but unfortunately, this point is never made at the policy table. This point is made at webinars like this, and the policy table is very, very far removed, as Fasih Saab will tell you. It's God knows where it is. It's somewhere on Mars. But nevertheless, we'll bring in Safdar Sohail, long-time Ministry of Commerce person. Safdar Saab, solve the problem for us. How do we deal with so many competing interests and in the fifth?
Thank you very much. Good to be with you and in this webinar. We, Dr. Nadeemul Haq, tried to kind of solve the problem when he was at the Planning Commission, and actually the cabinet initiated a national tariff reform exercise, which he headed. And my office as DG Trade Policy was the secretariat of that reform exercise. And when I was asked to prepare for this webinar, I started not exactly from that, from the results of that reform exercise, which I would briefly share, rather from the first Strategic Trade Policy Framework 2009, where we very loudly claimed that we would strengthen the linkages between trade and development. And one of that link was that we would make the trade work for the ordinary people, which would then involve to remove those market distortions which have negative impact for the consumers. But right from the beginning, I would say that the previous speakers have highlighted the impact of anti-export bias and touched upon the implications of this anti-export bias on the consumer welfare, which is fine, which is a well-researched area. And the fresh evidence has been presented today also, which is excellent. But as Dr. Nadeem also said, that we are doing it for such a long time. Why don't we have results? So there, I personally would like to see the things from the other end. That is the market, the nature of market that Pakistan has developed over time. We would definitely talk about the state-market relationships, because it is expected that if there are market distortions, let's say compromises of competition policies, then the state should intervene to rectify that. Now, in our case, we have two bodies which are supposed to take care of the consumer welfare laws created by the international trade, that is National Tariff Commission, and then we have Competition Commission of Pakistan. But the consumer welfare loss does not only happen due to international trade, it happens in the domestic commerce also. And then the overlap or the back and forth between domestic commerce and international trade is also a big time reality. There are very few sectors where you can very neatly separate the international trade. Uh, so traditionally, this turf battle that we faced, Dr. Nadeem would remember, in that tariff reform exercise, we brought in Gary Purcell, who did an excellent report, which did talk about the consumer welfare laws and reminded the National Tariff Commission that they should try to define what do they mean by not passing the excessive costs of protection to the consumers. Now, has National Tariff Commission ever produced some quality knowledge on that, that what do they really mean by that excessive cost passed on as the protection policy, as they pass their verdict on the consumers? Now, apparently, there has been a lot of debate on removing the duality between the industrial use and commercial use. We all are aware of those debates. And Ministry of Commerce has been told so many times that, look, if the tariff setting comes to the Ministry of Commerce, then the things should improve, because the FBR and Ministry of Finance remain more attached with the revenue generation. So that happened. In the STPF 2012-15, the cabinet approved the principles of tariff policy, and now we have an approved national tariff policy, which has one provision which talks about the role of the national tariff policy in enhancing the consumer welfare. Now, we understand that 18 meetings, I got myself informed today from the Ministry of Commerce, of the subcommittees have taken place. From the budget of 2020-21, there have been significant reductions. Now, 5 months, can we have some evidence? I'm not sure. But to me, it's a bit problematic to bring the evidence from the consumption levels of the effect of reducing the tariffs. Now, another aspect which I would like to share is that because I'm looking the whole problem from the economic governance angle. My last assignment before I retired was as Special Secretary Cabinet, and Cabinet Division has a lot of regulatory authorities, and I was directly involved with them. And what happens in those regulatory authorities is interesting to share, in the sense that we know of the compromises and welfare laws in the telecom sector, for example, or in the oil sector, or in the power sector. Now, these regulatory authorities say loudly and proudly in their annual reports that one of their function is to enhance the consumer welfare and to promote competition. But their annual reports, helped by the auditors, external auditors, seldom talk about the actions that they had taken. We do not have any consolidated publication in Pakistan which brings this subject into a major contestation, that what is happening to the consumer welfare, what are the historical trends at the sectoral level. And if the Auditor General's office tries to suggest to a regulatory authority that some of your decisions have caused this much loss, which is then passed on to the consumers, they say that you cannot touch us because our decisions have a statutory function. And then what finally happens is that the decisions have to go to the courts, and the the behavior of the judicialization of the regulations in Pakistan in terms of competition, application of competition laws has unfortunately been, what word should I use, disappointing. In the wake of, or using the excuse of 18th Amendment, our courts literally made Competition Commission irrelevant. They took good 8-9 years in announcing this decision about the jurisdiction of Competition Commission after 18th Amendment. Still, there are some issues. That announcement was, that verdict was announced last month. Now, our market, our businesses, they do take cover of the courts, let's say, to avoid, one can say, the jurisdictions. But coming to the international trade again, we have been working closely with the Competition Commission. Dr. Nadeem would remember that we, in his tariff reform exercise, we made a subcommittee which was to be headed by the Competition Commission of Pakistan to address this issue in a focused way. But Competition Commission never came. They never used their convening power to hold the meetings of that committee, and we went nowhere. FBR also, by the way, did not cooperate with us. Now, in this context, the Competition Commission says that, look, in many countries, the offenses related to Competition Commission are criminal offenses, and the individual consumer can go to the court, whereas in case of Pakistan, this is an administrative offense. Now, this is an issue which needs a very good debate in Pakistan, that why is it so, and how far we have to go before we see the consumer loss being addressed properly. If you ask National Tariff Commission, they say that, look, we don't have suo motu powers. Nobody comes to us, but we do conduct our hearings in open, and people can come if they want. But if you look at the decisions of National Tariff Commission, you would not find potential possible consumer welfare loss as a major consideration for them. Now, the way this webinar also has been designed is the consumer welfare loss appears as a rider, it appears as an additional consideration when, let's say, World Bank or USAID is asking the government to liberalize the tariff more. My concern today is linked more on the other side, the question that why has it not happened? We accept and respect the academic evidence which tells us that higher tariffs result in different kind of losses, including welfare loss, but the system is not moving. So there, I would like to draw the attention of the audience to the political economy aspect of this state market relationship, where over a period of time, over the decades, we have a particular version of market in Pakistan, and we need to understand the sociological side, if you can allow me to use that expression. I use the framework normally to analyze such situations used by the Flickstein, who says that in state market relationships, there are strategic action fields, direct strategic action fields, and indirect strategic action fields. And when there is enough strength in an issue, then the stability and continuity can change, and a new problem could be contested, and then the reorganization of the strategic action fields impacts on the final outcome. Now, our media, our academia, the donors have not been able to make the consumer welfare loss into a contestation. It is noted, it is talked about, there are some papers, there are some noise, but that is all. We in Ministry of Commerce, we have been trying to reduce the the protections of the auto sector, and I can go into graphic details of the way these strategic action fields operate, including the forum hopping of decision making also. So we need to understand the dynamic of stability and change in terms of the contestation that we are talking about today. If we understand that better, then I think we can move forward identifying the worst forms of consumer welfare loss, and then involve the relevant authorities. Personally, there is a major problem, and I would end here, that where should be the competition commission standing in all this? What should be the relationship between National Tariff Commission and competition commission? And if this is an issue which is linked with international trade and domestic commerce, one of the major reasons of having domestic commerce of Commerce was that Ministry of Commerce should be responsible for the issues in domestic commerce also. But Competition Commission continues to be attached with the Finance Division, and then Finance Division has those other imperatives linked with the revenue mobilization. So perhaps one good review which we need to do is to separate the Treasury from the economic policy making. And instead of using the terminology of economic ministries, we should talk about the trade and exchange, which would involve international trade and domestic commerce both. In so many countries, competition commissions are attached, or they are autonomous, but nominally they do not belong to the Ministry of Finance, because that creates their own problems. We have this spate of reports, so ATA Commission report and Sugar Commission report and oil and all that. We know what kind of state the state market relationship in Pakistan today stand. So in that context, we perhaps need to look at the governance and then prepare our civil servants, who are one of the actors, along with the media, along with other strategic action fields, to understand what is happening, and then to help this contestation produce results with the help of academia. I'm not sure about the donors. Here we have talked about FDI. I don't want to go into the details that how FDI, the kind of bilateral investment agreements we have, the kind of protections that FDI has been asking and we have been given, and the kind of distortion that has also created. So we need to review the governance structure of this particular market-state relationship aspect from the consumer side. But who is going to represent the consumer? That is the major question. The whole conversation is lost into cascading and intermediate. Gary Purcell also said in his report that how should one discover the consumer welfare loss in case of final products, intermediate products, and raw materials. So there is a need to produce that kind of a knowledge where we can enable those strategic action fields who stand up for the consumers, and then take the contestation to the logical conclusion in terms of positive outcomes for the consumer. I wish the National Tariff Commission and Ministry of Commerce good luck. But to me, many times it appears that it was more of a battle of turf. Now they have the last say in setting the tariff, but would they really make a difference in terms of the long-term strategic objectives, one of which, of tariff objective, one of which is the consumer welfare? Thank you. Your mic is mute. Dr. Deem, your mic is mute.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Safdar Saab. I'm glad you reminded me of the Gary Purcell episode. I'd completely forgotten about it. Yes, we have gone through a number of hoops, but somehow the debate doesn't get going. Gonzalo, you also saw from what Safdar said, how difficult it is to coordinate in the government. Just the Competition Commission, Tariff Commission, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Commerce, they can't sit together and they can't talk. And that's the biggest problem of all. You convene meetings and nobody turns up. This is, unless the Prime Minister calls the meeting, nothing happens. When you go to the Prime Minister, he's got 15 minutes. So I'm sorry, there's very little process in the government to make things happen. And yes, of course, you're right. The large industrialists have the seat at the table. They're the only guys at the table and the civil servants. The rest of us are not at the table. So there's very little you can do there. But nevertheless, the problem remains. I would also like to point out that dynamics is very important, as Hassan Malik pointed out. There is a kind of a monkey with the coconut thing, that the monkey can't leave the coconut. There is this thing that the industry feels that I've got this goodie, I can't give it up. And the government doesn't have the guts to take that goodie away. So therefore we are caught with this car subsidy that's been, or the vegetable oil subsidy that's been lasting for the last, or the protection that's been lasting for the last 70 years and doesn't seem to move. The second thing is non-tariff barriers are also very important. Just like now, when I was in the Planning Commission, we moved the car, second-hand car, from 3 to 5 years. And within 6 months, they came back and it came to 3. Now it's down to almost nothing because there's so many barriers set up to second-hand cars. The prices have gone up dramatically. So, you know, the protection has gone up dramatically. Now, these non-tariff barriers are also very important in getting the protection story right. But I will not try and dilate on this. Let's talk about that later. Let me go quickly to the floor because people have been waiting. Mohammad Bashir Saab. Please, panelists, note the questions, etc. You'll have a chance to respond at the end. Mohammad Bashir Saab.
Thank you, Nadeem. Always a great pleasure to be with you. And you have a...
Bashir Malik Saab. Bashir Malik Saab, let me also introduce you. Famous industrialist. Most important industrialist. Go ahead, Malik Saab.
I can tell you one from two perspectives, being one of the largest retailers in the country, and as well as one of the largest exporters for the last, I think, 30 years. So having really ground reality experience. And of course, all these talks are very, very educative, and we understand this, and we've been listening to all this for a long time. But the ground realities are totally different. One of them, of course, Hassan Malik raised about the electricity, but it was not that. There was no energy. Your factories were closed for 3 hours a day or something. On top of that, you had an if you look at Pakistan's history, your exchange rate has been totally import biased for the last, if you take the total years, 70 years, at least 70% of the time or 80%, your exchange rate has been anti-export totally. And so what do? You kept your exchange rate at 100 for 5 years. You lost your market share. You did the same thing when the quotas went. You lost your market share because when the quotas went, China went 10 times the market. Bangladesh took the market, every country. Pakistan had an exchange rate which they stuck to 60 rupees for 5 years. And they just didn't want to move it, or 76 for 7-8 years. So, when you do this to industry, so much of the replacement, the modernization, the balancing of the industry to keeping update goes away. So whenever you make these small tweaks and do it, you say, oh, we've given this subsidy. Now also, I saw the finance minister saying, we are showing how much subsidy we give to the export sector. It's not how much subsidy they give to the export sector. They are saying how much subsidy they're giving to the domestic sector. So they're blaming the export sector. The domestic people get the subsidy, not the domestic sector. The people, the poor people get the subsidy. The exports and the industry subsidizes it. Now, when they give it back and try to give a level playing field, they say we are giving a subsidy. So the talk is totally, when they give you a refund, they say, oh, we've given you subsidies. But this is the taxes you paid. I mean, I've been owed 5 billion rupees now for 5 years. They're not giving. They said, oh, it's too big. We are giving it to the small guys. So, this is the language you hear in the FBR. They said, we want to give it to somebody who's got 50,000 and 100,000 and 200,000. We have to give them first. So how do you build scale? How do you compete in the international market? In the domestic market, you have got to first see what goods can be smuggled and what goods cannot be smuggled. That is the most important thing. There you can have custom duties because those goods can't be. But if your goods, if you are in trading in goods which are coming in Afghan transit or under-invoiced or smuggled, you have to raise the duties to make it more difficult for the smugglers or things like that and try to make it more expensive for them. But of course, it's an incentive also. And with the conditions in the country, it's a very fine balance. How do you balance? It's a balancing act all the time. And it's a very, very difficult act to do it, because the people have been at the FBR, they're so powerful, and the Afghan lobby is so powerful, and with the American lobby combined, to give the Afghanis that access of smuggled goods back into Pakistan, Pakistan has no say. They want peace, to buy peace. Now you have a very tough neighbor, India, who's trying to finish your economy. You have Iran there, has his own interest, and you have Afghanistan there. What do? You can't have a regional integration. You can't have regional benefits of trade. You can't do anything. So you're in a very, very special situation. So you've got to then see every product separately, what to do with it. And then you got to see what has been happening over the years and how that industry has been affected. Of course, and then what do? Your raw material has been wiped out. On cotton, you have a regulatory duty and an import duty on your raw material. Now they've taken it out at this stage when they found out that there was nothing left in the country to buy, and it was all damaged cotton. So, these decisions are so impractical, so late, that you have no chance to survive. How many people have been left? And when I started, when I came back from England, I think 90% of the people have been wiped out who are in the industry. They're all new guys now coming. So you can find out the only 10% left of the original. Why? If the industry was so viable, why did everybody go into power sector, the other sectors, cement, sugar? Why? Because those were the ones which were the subsidized ones. Those are the ones who are getting the rental. Where things cannot be smuggled, where things cannot be, there's a freight disadvantage or something. So you've got to separate all these things. You are talking generally. And when you talk generally, I think it's just not fair. I think you need to really work out on a systematic basis. So I would request all of you to really do your homework properly on each segment, and then consult the trade, and then make these strategies and policies. Thank you, sir.
Fair point, Bashir Sahab. Bashir Sahab, this is why the Soviet Union collapsed, because they were trying to do too many detailed sort of intermediations, trying to plan the economy, trying to make every little sector work. And unfortunately, we have learned through the Soviet experience and many other experiences that it's just not possible. The government is not capable of mediating so many interests. That is why it is better to leave some things to the market, because the market can solve it on its own. And yes, it's painful, no doubt, but the government can't solve all problems. If it does, it leads to a collapse. But nevertheless, I'll go on to Mr. Javed Hassan. Javed Hassan Saab.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
जी वालेकुम सलाम। जावेद हसन साहब, chairman of NAFTEC.
जी अच्छा, I have two questions. One relates to Gonzalo, because one of the things I've been looking at separately is the complexity of the economy, which is something which I think you're all aware of. Hidalgo and Hausman have been working on, and it depends on, there's a Harvard lab which looks at how complex a economy is, how sophisticated it is, and there we are looking at the basic capabilities within an economy, and they look at exports, and for that we need to have a greater diversity of exports, and it's something which I think one of the speakers touched upon. But to have a greater diversity, we need to really actually see a product base which is much more, and we need to see much more intermediary products, the tariffs being reduced. By having tariffs in all sorts of intermediary and some of the end products as well, we are effectively preventing the diversity of our export base, and effectively also reducing our capabilities. And once we are reducing our capabilities, there's a strong correlation between capabilities and the sophistication of the economy and your long-term growth. Now I come back to the question that was addressed, that we need to provide jobs. Now, at what cost do we need to provide jobs, I ask? Now, is it the role of the government to make sure that even the most internationally uncompetitive industries, they should carry on, so that because they are providing jobs? I can name a few industries in these countries which are getting as much as 50, 60% tariff protection, and because they are supposedly providing jobs. Now, if they are actually getting 50, 60% protection to provide jobs, someone must be earning that money. The wealth is coming, so there's some wealth transference taking place. so I wouldn't want to know how many people are getting these jobs to actually take money from a lot more people. So it's a transference of wealth from the many to the few in creating these jobs. And we really need to think about it. Are these jobs not going to happen if there's wealth in the society anyway? And this is the argument often used for cascading tariffs. So there are two questions. Do we really, as a policy objectives, do we protect jobs willy-nilly? Or do we want to really have a policy objective that focus much more on the intrinsic innate capabilities within the economy so that long-term growth prospects are better, so that we have efficiency-seeking investments coming into the country rather than the protective market that most of these investors are coming into. Much of the FDI that I've seen has not really come to re-export or to actually see it as efficiency. They're really basically, I can name a few big names, I won't do that, but they're basically looking at the domestic market because it's protected. So, so basically two questions. Do we need greater complexity and sophistication? And is our policy objectives protect jobs at any cost a valid one?
Good. Very good, Javed. Javed, for another example of complexity being used for Pakistan, read my book. It's a different version of complexity. I think complexity is very important. It has not come to Pakistan yet. Just like many other recent developments have come to Pakistan, complexity will take another 30 years to come to Pakistan. We'll wait, doesn't matter. Whether you and I are around or not doesn't matter, but people here don't know complexity. I've taught 2 courses on this in lumps, but that's it. Okay, now we go to Muhammad Shahid Wahid. Shahid Saab, are you speaking? I guess not. Then let's go to Noor Mahal. Noor Mahal, unmute yourself.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Oh.
I was using my daughter's account, Moazzam Ali Tour here, life member PIDE. Thank you very much for providing me the opportunity. First with the Punjabi idiom, Kamli hove ek te samjhave veda. Te je kamla veda te samjhave keda. So the fact of the matter is that
Translate bhi kar de for a foreign friend.
When we say if there is someone goof in a city or in a village, then entire village come to help her or him. But if the entire village is goof, then who is going to mentor them? So the problem is that whoever is the player, is it the government, is the ministry or the attached departments, is the private sector? If you measure them in terms of quality, productivity, honesty, excellence, all of the players are below average. That is a very honest. I'm myself from the private sector. But the honest and the fact of the matter is that as a village, none of us is willing to perspire. Either it's a bureaucracy, civil or military, or a private sector. Everyone want to make money in the minimum possible time without waiting or without giving any chance to the one who is performing better than them. Number one. I mean, if we gave even this monopoly commission to Ministry of Commerce, what magical things they are going to do? If you write to them 40 letters, in 2013, I wrote a letter on the China trade, Pak-China trade, to include the meat. It just took 7 years just to include, and still they have non-tariff barrier. Any policy we make for the country, we have negative impact, and the other people get the benefit. Pak, Sri Lanka, free trade, before that we were 80-90% positive. After the free trade, we were negative. So, for example, we have export promotion officer in all the embassies. In last 25 years, wherever I physically went or wrote them for help, we never received any help. So whether it's the Ministry of Commerce or FBR or it's the Ministry of Finance, we have to understand the existing non-accountable, non-professional structure has totally collapsed. It's actually not working. On the opposite, the business sector, the private sector, mostly doing dishonest practices. ये जो जितना सब्सिडी गेम है, इसके अंदर 30 to 40% आर्टिफिशियल रेजिंग होती है प्राइस की. That's the true. हमारे साथ ही करते हैं.
Come to the point that
Incorrection. But this is a matter of the fact. लेकिन ये है कि until we as a collective, as a nation, we don't pledge to change or improve, we will keep on going behind. We want to cut the branch while sitting on the same side. So we are going to fall.
Okay.
So Allah has la tabdila li sunnatillah. Allah अपनी सुन्नत तब्दील नहीं करता. He doesn't change his way.
Right.
If we will not change.
Good point.
The worst example is Bangladesh. You know, we got rid of them, that they are very backward and they cannot keep up with the West Pakistan.
Okay, Tursab, we have to now go to another question.
Right, sir.
You made a very good point.
Sir, always better. Thank you very much, sir.
Khan Sahab? Shafat Khan? नहीं है. फिर महमूद खालिद. क्या हो रहा है? इनका माइक नहीं चल रहा. महमूद खालिद, are you there? Okay. शाहिद वहीद साहब, बताइए अगर आप आ सकते हैं.
अस्सलामुअलैकुम सर.
बोलो जी. Go ahead.
सर, मेरा नाम शाहिद वहीद है, अप्लाइड इकोनॉमिक रिसर्च सेंटर से. सर इंग्लिश सर जिससे सवाल है वो इंशाल्लाह समझ जाएंगे.
नहीं, आप इंग्लिश
उर्दू में
सबके लिए बेहतर.
सर इंग्लिश. अच्छा, एक मिनट. Sir, my question is about the trade openness. That why our agriculture goods are banned. That why our agriculture trade is not open with our neighbors, from which we get more benefits. Why there is a ban on open trade with Iran and Afghanistan, where our farmers can get more benefits, and by which we increase our GDP and other economic indicators. Side by side, the problem of shortage should be resolved by the substitution of these agricultural goods, or by importing that goods on low cost from other countries like Australia and other European countries. So why there is a ban on agriculture goods and there are subsidies to the other industrial goods? If we are agriculture country, then why there is a ban with our neighbor countries like Afghanistan, where we can get more benefits up to 4. Thank you, sir.
Question. Let's move on. Kamar Zaman, sir. Kamar Zaman.
Sorry. Assalamualaikum, sir. Sorry, my mic wasn't switching on, sir.
Okay.
So there's no doubt about this having low tariffs and its import on exports. Once we look at we add a detail.
So everybody knows you.
Yeah, my name is Kamar Zaman, sir. I am again an officer of Commerce Ministry working in Prime Minister's office currently.
Okay.
And we had a detailed discussion about Vietnam, sir. Even if we look at some of the other countries like Hong Kong, like Singapore, these are all very low tariff countries. But I believe that in Pakistani context, the problem lies somewhere else. The problem lies in our revenue collections. Once we break down our revenue collection, you would see that 50% of our revenue tariff is collected from Karachi port alone. Number one. Number two, the gentleman who spoke before me mentioned very rightly, we are an agriculture country, but once we look at our agriculture products exports, we'll find that live animals export is banned. We'll find that our sugar and even the basic commodity like wheat are very much regulated. So all in all, I find that the overall policy paradigm of Pakistan is very much status quo oriented. The policymakers, they really don't like to tinker with it. That's why our exports were maybe, I'll say, at the same level 10 years back, and they are at the same level now. But I find in Pakistani context that once we come from the investment perspective, the people who have established themselves into some industries, they have created so many barriers by using the existing policies for the other players that these are the same kind of people. It keeps going on and on. Like once I like to mention that recently Pakistan and China, they signed an FTA, and in FTA, aluminium and copper ingots were included in that part of FTA. But today, the day before yesterday, there was a meeting of Pakistan. There was a meeting of Pakistan Fan Manufacturers Association in which they said that there should be RD on exports of copper and aluminium. Today, I saw one of the advertisement from the Pakistan Automotive Association, this vehicle manufacturers association, that aluminium and copper exports should be placed under regulatory regime. So in all, I believe that it has become somewhat a culture of protection, a culture in which the status quo, and I must not be saying rent seeking, but somewhat a culture of status quo, which is perpetuating in Pakistan continuously. And I'd like to mention here about investment only. I'll just take a minute, sir, that in Pakistan, I find the biggest problem with investment is our regulatory regime. Like our visas, Pakistani visa is a big issue. Pakistanis don't offer nationalities to anyone else. In Pakistan, foreigners cannot purchase lands. In Pakistan, getting utility connections is almost impossible for the new industries. We have recently imposed a ban on new industrial gas connections as well. And there were the plethora of issues like environment-related issues, social compliance-related issues, and then most importantly, we are a difficult countries to foreigners to live in as well, considering our religious and social issues as well. This is a very complex, I'll say, issues or problems which Pakistan is confronted with at the moment. Thank you, sir.
Correct, Shafat Sahab. Complexity is the key. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Shafat Khan Sahab.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself before. I have a question from Gonzalo. I found his presentation really.
Introduce yourself as well, so everybody knows.
Hi, I'm a recent graduate, PhD graduate, and I'll be joining the World Bank next week, actually. So I'm an incoming economist there.
Congratulations.
Thanks a lot. I found Gonzalo's presentation really insightful. I think it was well structured, and it was a good mix of mechanism as well as data details that we need for this discussion. I have a question from Gonzalo, which is related to his mechanism about how higher consumer goods tariffs actually impede exports. So usually when we think of this mechanism, we think of exporting and domestic production as an independent decision, but I don't think anybody believes that. So I think your story fits well there. But what interdependence do you have in mind when you talk about firms sacrificing exports for domestic market because of high consumer goods tariff? Is it the capacity constraints? Is it financial frictions that is causing that, or do you have anything else in mind, or what could be at play when you look at Pakistan? Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Last question, Mahmood Khalid. You have a question, Mahmood Khalid?
Sir, thank you. Actually, I couldn't unmute earlier as well. My context is related with Dr. Safdar Suhail, as you have rightly pointed out, and you have also carried out the complexity of the issue. Can we think about not just the tariff incentives, but the credit-related incentives, the energy pricing incentives, and maybe link them with kind of a KPIs that can resolve the problem? Because efforts should be really encouraged, and those who are actually not performing well should be discouraged, and they should be weeded out from the system so that more opportunities could be created for the better performers.
Thank you. Thank you, Mahmood Khalid Saab. Okay, folks, I'll come back to the panel. As you have seen, the issue is very, very complex, and complexity is the key. But I said we don't understand complexity, and it will take a long time for us to understand that. The framework of economic growth that I prepared in the Planning Commission 2011 was also based on complexity. But at that time, it was premature. We didn't even know anything about complexity. The key issue here is that there's just too many complex interlinkages. That is why I backed off into getting a civil service reform or governance reform done. We have to have a government that is capable of doing this. But the World Bank chose to make a competition commission, Gonzalo, and the World Bank chose to make these regulatory agents, which has further fragmented government. Now OGRA is being dismantled. So I don't know where we are going. Our governance is perpetually being dismantled. with Fasih Saab going after DEI. Do we have a governance system that's going to be able to do it? But over to you, Gonzalo, if you can take on all these questions. There's a question of perspiration, question of employment, question of the exchange rate mishandled, then we compensated tariff, taxes mishandled, then we compensated tariff mishandled, then we compensated subsidy mishandled, then we compensated the refunds mishandled, then we compensated this. How long can this continue? I mean, where will World Bank come in and patch fix? You guys are patch fixing all the time. You have no comprehensive approach, or do you? Go ahead, Gonzalo.
Okay, so I will start by saying that this needs to be sorted out by the government of Pakistan and by Pakistan's people, right? So that's the first thing I want to say. This is not the World Bank's role or any other international institution. These are decisions that the Pakistani people need to make, and they elect. They elect politicians that are in place and appoint government officials. But apart from that, I wanted to touch upon what Ehsan Malik and Mr. Bashir mentioned, because I wanted to start with this, but then I didn't. That is, I couldn't agree more with the fact that Pakistan needs jobs, and I'm not a market fundamentalist in the sense of saying, oh, what we need to do is we need to reduce tariffs to zero, eliminate all sorts of support mechanisms. My point is that the way in which firms get support in Pakistan is not delivering on the objective. That is my main point. And in particular, is that tariffs as a way of protecting is quite an inefficient way of protecting that hasn't delivered in Pakistan. And here I couldn't agree more with Mr. Bashir's point on exchange rates and the role that they have had, not only on exports, but also on the strength of the industrial sector in general, right? So what has happened for much of the 2010-2020 decade, so that second decade of the 21st century, is that you have a basic policy inconsistency with an overvalued exchange rate, and then at the same time high tariffs with marked cascading, which meant that you were making it very difficult for exporters to export because of the overvalued exchange rate, and you were making it easy for importers to import because the exchange rate was overvalued, and at the same time you had relatively low tariffs on intermediates and raw materials, higher on final goods. And so you had all these firms that were importing inputs and were selling domestically, and so your current account balance collapsed, and you had a deficit for a long time that basically led to accumulation of net foreign liabilities for Pakistan. That means, more like a higher likelihood of having current account imbalances in the future. So I do agree with the exchange rate problem having been a huge problem for the industrial sector and for exporters. Now, what I would like I would like actually to hear more from people that are in the private sector, but also from policymakers and academia, is can we sit down and think of a different way of supporting the private sector that is more effective? So what is the challenge? Is the challenge capabilities? So we need to invest in capabilities. Is the challenge export, like information about foreign markets? Is the challenge certification and standard compliance? So if we identify what the challenge is, then we can perhaps say, okay, we need to support the private sector because we need jobs and because there may be some gains associated with more sophisticated manufacturing, as Javed was mentioning, et cetera, that perhaps warrant some sort of support. But let's try to identify a way of supporting that is, first of all, that has sunset clauses. Second, that has conditionalities in terms of performance, as Ehsan Malik was mentioning. And third, that levels the playing field so that we give the same, sort of the same to everyone, and we don't discriminate against those that are new. And one thing that the State Bank Pakistan did that I thought it was a very good decision recently is open up the LTFF and the EFS to more sectors than before. So before these export finance schemes that are subsidized, we're focusing only on specific sectors. So open that up, allow ICT exporters also to avail to that type of, and so open it up, leveling the playing field, introducing sunset clauses and introducing performance conditions. I think it's a way of supporting the private sector that is much more effective than having tariffs that create a lot of distortions, that allocate resources inefficiently, and that haven't worked anyway. So it's not that they have worked to support industrialization. So I think that's my point, and I think that's where I think we need a little bit more debate. And then I will just mention briefly on Shafat's question. It's a difficult question, but the way I'm thinking about it is, if you're a firm that has two options to sell domestically or export, right? And the tariff structure gives incentives and tilts your relative prices away from exporting and into selling domestically. The likelihood that you will make the investments needed to have the infrastructure required to be able to export, because exporting is a difficult thing. It's not these firms, when you decide to produce, you need to choose two ways. It's perhaps in more sophisticated countries, you're going to be able to sell domestically or sell the same product abroad. But in a country like Pakistan, where there is a gap between the quality required in the domestic market and the quality required abroad, you need to invest in capacity that is different for exporting and for non-exporting. And if the current tariff structure incentivizes your selling domestically, you're not going to invest in capacity to produce exportables. So there you have the type of investment required to produce exportables is not incentivized by the current tariff structure. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Yes, it's a mess. So Asansa, please, why don't you come in and pick up some of the questions and tell us, is employment is manufacturing the only way to get employment? Because quite frankly, manufacturing is only about 18% of the job market, I think. Services,
no, so it isn't the only. Obviously, agriculture is a huge potential, and it also would benefit the rural economy and so on. But just to clarify, jobs at any cost is not an objective for anyone. But I mean, I want you to look at the way, if you divide Pakistan's total population of 210 million into 5, so you have 5 quintiles, yeah? You disregard the bottom quintile and you say, well, they don't have any money to buy anything, and they're, hand to mouth, etc. And you take the top quintile out because you say they've got so much money that they couldn't care less where the products are made and they will always buy imported products. You still have 130 million people in the middle, in the middle 3 quadrants. Now 130 million is a lot of population. So you should therefore, all other things being equal, be able to generate enough scale to be competitive. But what has happened? If you start from 2007 and you come to last year, because we don't have this year's figures, yeah, footwear, total imports up 3-fold, pumps 4-fold, glassware 6-fold, tiles 3-fold, blankets 3-fold, fans 3-fold. Now I put to you, are these very sophisticated products that we should not be making locally for 130 million population, which is in the middle quintile? Surely we should be making them, yeah. But why have we stopped making them? Because of all the other impediments that have come in the way. If you don't have energy, you can't produce, so forget the cost of energy. Then you have the energy, but your cost is about 25% or 30% higher than the global norms. Yeah, you don't have the scale. You haven't given enough industry enough time to build that scale, so you need to be able to provide that. But moving on, I mean, I think from an overall perspective, obviously tariffs is not the only tool. You have to take a holistic approach, an approach that deals with all the silo manner in which all the ministries work and all the policy framers work. Also, I want to clarify, this notion of subsidy needs to be understood. What is a subsidy? Subsidy is not the difference between an uncompetitive cost, which is what Pakistan's energy cost is, and what is being given to the exporters to become competitive globally. That is not a subsidy. You are actually providing the exporters the means to compete globally by giving them a cost which is comparative to the cost in Bangladesh or the cost in India. Yeah. Everybody turns around and say, oh, this is a huge subsidy. It's not a subsidy at all. If you were to offer the same to the local industry, and you call it a subsidy, that's not a subsidy. I mean, the subsidy, the covering the cost of theft of electricity, covering the cost of inefficient transmission, is not a subsidy. Covering the cost of government departments and institutions not paying for the electricity they use and putting the burden of that on industry is surely not a subsidy. Yeah. So I think we need to get those right. Look, neoclassical economics is, I don't think, what Gonzalo is advocating, and Washington consensus is not what we are advocating. But just run through what was Washington consensus all about. It was about low borrowing cost. Low government borrowing. But what happens in Pakistan? The government crowds out the private sector from credit. It was about tax reforms. It was about broadening the tax base, having moderate marginal tax rates. Surely that doesn't exist in Pakistan. It was having competitive exchange rates. Well, we now have competitive exchange rates, but for about 4 or 5 years we had static exchange rates, uncompetitive exchange rates. It talks about privatization of state-owned enterprises. Which private sector, which state-owned enterprise has been privatized of any standing? It talks about deregulation. What have we got in Pakistan? We've got a bloated bureaucracy. We've got a colonial era set of regulations that were designed to control the natives. It was not about empowering industry. It was not about empowering job creation. It was about controlling. It was about taxing. Yeah. And incidentally, who are they trying to control? They are trying to control half the business which is in the formal sector. The rest is, by the way, in the informal sector that the civil servants can't even reach. It was Washington consensus was also about creating legal security, which is speed and quality of judgments. It was also about protection of intellectual property. Do those things happen in Pakistan? They surely don't. So obviously tariffs is only one way to do it, but you've got to fix all this and then say, are we moving in the right direction or not? If you don't, we will continue to deindustrialize. And yes, surely manufacturing is not the only way to create jobs. We should be creating jobs in the IT sectors, in the back offices, in the call centers, etc. But we haven't got the policies right for that. But this is I don't want to go into that aspect. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Sansa, thank you. Very good. I think you made a very good point that because there's so much messed up everywhere, we should compensate in another direction. So when energy is messed up, we compensate with a subsidy. When tariffs are messed up, we compensate here. It's just a mess. That's where complexity comes in, and that's where we really need to think about it. Javed Saab, you have another point. Go ahead. Javed Hassan. Javed, do you want to make another point or no? Okay, no. Let me then go to Fasih Saab. Fasih Saab, there's a huge charge of the government here. I want a very simple question from you.
Hello. I'm here. I can
go ahead. Go ahead, Javed. It's a quick comment.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, Ahsan Saab. There are many complex issues, but let's take it for a given that electricity costs in Pakistan are higher. And that's just as it is. Now, it's not fair, it's not good, but that's how it is. We have to assume these are basically intrinsic components of our economy now, like it or not. And for that, let's assume that for a second that we shouldn't be subsidized, because there are many other intrinsic things which are very bad. There's one beneficiary or another loser. So let's walk away from that for a second. But I take a very simple thing, and I'm not going to name any particular brand, but if I'm buying a car which is for 40 lakhs, because of the tariffs and various processes in it, which ordinarily should cost 20 lakhs, now I'll assume that the person who is buying that car is not necessarily working in another protected industry. He obviously is creating the wealth for buying that 40 lakhs. Now that extra 20 lakhs that he's actually paying in tariffs, he could have used that capital in creating some jobs or consumption. So my point is that there's an assumption here that if we don't give protective tariffs for the value-added sector, jobs will somehow disappear and there'll be nothing happening. Now, if there is wealth actually in the system, then there must be other alternative jobs that will emerge if we remove, or even these existing companies might actually get more efficient. I think there's a fair element, and quite right, you should be fearful, because yes, if there's a sort of uncoordinated reduction in tariffs, you can have the cases as you have seen in some of the developed markets. But we have to really be cognizant that there is transference of wealth here, and we need that also should be a policy objective that we should be questioning. I can give you another steel industry for basic raw bar material. We are paying something like 30% more than any other country. So one can go into the specifics. And this is something which I think a body like PBC probably needs to address. So what are we protecting, and are we actually creating value? Are we really actually protecting jobs even? Because you are actually taking wealth away. Sorry, okay. This is my...
Thank you. Sansab, do you want to say something? Or?
No, so my counter question would be, who's taking this wealth away? Is it the government of Pakistan through higher tariffs?
Those who are being protected.
Javed sir,
you're absolutely right. The state itself is an extractor here.
Yeah.
The state is obviously extracting.
Let him answer. Go ahead, Sansab.
No, okay. So high tariffs or high taxes take away the wealth from the private sector, for want of a better term, into the public sector, right? Now, if the public sector was to utilize that in an efficient manner, fix the electricity issues, fix all the other things, then at least we would be on a win-win basis. The problem is that all this extraction that happens in the form of taxes or tariffs or whatever is not being utilized in a proper manner. I mean, Pakistan does not rank anywhere, even in South Asia, in terms of socio-economic development. Within that, if you look at human capital development, that is sadly lacking. Every index will show Pakistan at the bottom, right? If you have a human capital which is underdeveloped, how do you expect them to have the skills, have the productivity levels to be able to compete in the international market? But forget the international market, even compete with imports coming into the country. So I go back to what I was saying. There has to be a holistic approach. You can't just pick up on one aspect or the other aspect. You have to, somebody has to bring everything together, align all the ministries, align all the policies. It's a major task. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to just be PBC or X or Y or Z that has to do it. Our job obviously is to highlight these issues. We've just recently issued a charter of economy. I don't know whether you had an opportunity to look at it. Please do. It is pointing into various pillars of the economy which are sadly lacking, which need to be addressed. So I'll just stop at that, because otherwise we get into a micro discussion.
This reminds me, I saw your charter of the economy and I meant to ask you, but let me ask you here. Let's do a webinar on that. Let's bring it out in the public. PIDE will host it. Let's do that, because I think it's an important thing to do too. I think this is a very good question that Hassan Sab raised, that we have to have a holistic approach, which is what Javed was also saying. And as Safdar said earlier, we need to align our ministries. Now, obviously, that's the job of the Ministry of Commerce. So I've got two individuals from the Ministry of Commerce, one current, one ex-secretary. So folks, Who wants to go first? Fasih Saab? Why do you tell us? What role is the Commerce Ministry playing in all this? I was in the Commerce Ministry in 2005. And even then I pointed out that the Commerce Ministry needs to play a more central role in commerce. To date, Commerce Ministry is not playing a central role in commerce. Why is that? I go to your website, I see nothing there. You give no real analysis. Why is this subject not analyzed by you? I have proposed for the last 15 years that we will prepare a state of commerce report for you. Even today, we are proposing it. But you guys don't have any reports at all. What is this ministry that gives us no reports, no analysis? We have to rely on the World Bank and we have to rely on others to give us an analysis. Is the ministry's job not to give us an analysis? Fasih Saab.
I can't speak on ministry's behalf right now. I'm not representing it today. However, I can try to explain things as they are.
Go ahead.
So the thing is that it's a sad state of affair that unfortunately trade or international trade does not figure very predominantly in our national policy mix. We tend to see that things like development and our international relations with a very different lens, and that lens unfortunately does not include questions of long-term trade and economic security or other aspects of it. So maybe we are in permanent stage of crisis where we are looking for short-term fixes most of the time. Having said that, I agree with you that Ministry of Commerce needs to play a more proactive role in bringing people together. But unfortunately, it's not a preeminent ministry among the ministries. You understand it better that preeminence belongs to somebody else and lies somewhere else. However, there is a need to reform all these structures over there. You need to enable Ministry of Commerce to build its capacities to do kind of analysis that you're referring to. And yes, Ministry of Commerce and Government of Pakistan has to put its house in order to facilitate these reforms that we're talking about. I tend to agree with these recommendations, which are asking for enhanced public policy consultations between the government and the private sectors when they're making policies, be it tariff policy or any other policy that they make, and there can't be any two views about it. I just have a small comment to make with regard to smuggling. Somebody raised this issue of smuggling. I tend to see that, it's actually high tariffs are a very strong incentive for illegal trade and smuggling. And in fact, this is the primary reason why things are getting smuggled into this country. And by maintaining high tariffs, we can't really control that. We have to improve enforcement of government and the government departments. We have to undertake reforms in Pakistan Customs and FBR, and I think that's the way how it should be done, and not by maintaining high tariffs at all. So I tend to agree that there's a holistic approach to things that is required, that is needed.
Thank you, Fasih Saab. Fasih Saab, one more question. How many projects do you have of technical assistance at the Ministry of Commerce? I know there's one by the World Bank or IFC, and I know there's this DI now. So how many projects do you have in the ministry to do your work?
There
was a US
a couple of others as well. I've seen that DFID is also, ICT is also probably starting a project with Ministry of Commerce, and World Bank and us are doing that. And our role is basically to help ministry arrive wherever it wants us to make intervention at an informed decision, bring
Can you give us how many
all the
million
stakeholders together.
dollars are involved in this? How many $1 million is DI getting to do this?
See, our project, which is now its fag end, had about $15 million. It started in 2015, and it had two components. One dealt with FBR, and it's advocating reforms in FBR for improving trade facilitation, and the other.
And then the World Bank project is $120 million, I'm told.
Okay.
Is that right, Gonzalo? Gonzalo? Gonzalo's gone?
Yeah, but what is the project the World Bank with?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Some project that they're doing with the Ministry of Finance, either IFC or you, $120 million through DFID or something on making Pakistan more competitive or something like that.
So what we do have is a technical assistance that is financed by DFID, by FCDO actually now.
Okay.
That's a, for the trade component is less than $300,000.
No, total project. What is the size of the total project?
The total project it's not only commerce, but it's also tax revenue mobilization. It's also finance, etc., etc. I don't have the numbers, but it's certainly way below 120 million. It's
way below 100.
Perhaps,
okay.
Way below. Like perhaps probably less than 10 million in total over 5 years.
Great, wonderful. Safdar Sahab, what is the Ministry of Commerce budget? I mean, their administrative budgets. I mean, the DI has $10 million here, $25 million. And what is the Ministry of Commerce's total budget? So let's get an idea of where we are in this business. Who is running the government? Safdar Sahab, unmute.
Well, I'll hesitate to give a direct answer. I'll give an indirect answer again with the help of the framework that I'm suggesting to use, that donors are one of the major strategic action fields in Pakistan. And there was a time when the Ministry of Commerce was less dependent on the donors. We established Pakistan Institute of Trade and Development precisely for this job of technical backstopping, and I can say with confidence that we considered Ministry of Commerce much more neutral as compared to the other ministries when it came to the questions of protections. You've spoken about the cars and the way policies would be reversed, and the forum hopping which would decision-making forums which would take place. Ministry of Commerce is a small ministry as such. Trade Development Authority is a bigger animal. Ministry has hardly 350 people. If you look at the senior level, more than half of the people are busy in the FTAs, and then some looking after the export development aspects. But now I would say that this acceleration of the distortions in the state market relationship. Now that has brought us to one such situation, that a kind of consensus that Ehsan Malik Saab is talking about. Who is going to deliver that? Can any one ministry be expected to deliver that? For me, it has to be Ministry of Commerce, but we know the governance weaknesses. I personally expected that the reform process, governance reform process being led by Dr. Ishrat would give due focus. In my view, international trade and domestic commerce should be separately handled as a subsystem. And then we all know the problems. Anti-export bias is okay, fine. But I think if we think that this is the central pillar of Pakistan's export development strategy for the next 5 years, okay, fine. Now we have the National Tariff Policy Board. Let's see how do they do. We can and should try to strengthen them, should make them realize that the matters of equity in state market relationships are extremely important. Somebody commented that even in domestic commerce, we have very, very serious market distortions. Now, who is going to attend to those distortions? We understand, we all know the histories of these isolated attempts to reduce, let's say, the protection levels of the auto sector, and we all know how things happen. So my main concern today has been to draw the attention of the audience to the how part. that why we have been unable to change the status quo in terms of state-market relationship, which is becoming actually worse. So there, the answer is in governance reforms. The answer is on creating trust. You know what happens in the auto sector. Whenever you start thinking of reforming it, they become too sensitive that government would move the pendulum to the other side. So the trust is not there. We need to realize the ground reality. Many people have talked about the smuggling. What has the unchecked smuggling done to Pakistan? It has seeped into the distribution channels up to the retail and wholesale outlets. Now that is a strategic action field to deal with. They would not like this to change. So we have to do a good dispassionate analysis of all the actors and networks and the relationship which play in the background in taking all these decisions. And then for me personally, if we can identify the worst casualties of consumer welfare in Pakistan, identify those sectors which we are allowing to happen just due to our inability to understand how the decision-making system works, and take out the worst casualties or miscarriage of equity in the system. I think there academia has a big role to play to make things really contested. I would not like to comment on the role of the donors here. They somehow have given scant attention to competition issues in terms of FDI, in terms of this is a separate topic. I wish we could speak more about that.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, World Bank, for helping us arrange this webinar. I think it's been a great debate. We should have more of these. We are going to take up Hassan Malik's PBC, forward-looking vision. We'll do that, inshallah, next. But let me just say that, you know, unfortunately, when you look at the economy, my past was always looking at partial equilibrium analyses. But when I came to Pakistan, I realized it just won't work, that complexity is the key issue, and we have to talk about how things are interconnected. Unfortunately, as Hassan Malik said, Bashir Ali Muhammad said that, look, for God's sakes, we've got you know, energy costs on the one side, documentation costs on the other side, taxation on this side, etc. So there's far too many issues. And that is why nobody's neoclassical here, nobody's free market here. But the key issue is that we've discovered that governments can be too clever by half. And the governments tend to think that they can affect each little sector down to the 6-digit level, each industry separately. It creates a mess, and that's what the Soviet Union tried, so it shouldn't happen. Secondly, if the government wants to tax while also losing money at the PSC level, government loses more money at the PSC level than it collects taxes. So I mean, that's also very strange. How can we keep collect taxes at a game that we keep losing? But in tariffs, let me tell you, Gonzalo, a very interesting story that very few people know, and you probably yourself don't know. My favorite place in Lahore is burnt down, Hafiz Center. Hafiz Center, last time I went there to buy a computer. It used to have lovely smuggled goods. As I told you, I'm a great fan of smuggled goods because, hey, that's my welfare. So Hafiz Center used to have lovely cell phones and lovely computers. In fact, I remember in Singapore trying to buy a cell phone, and the guy told me, are you from Pakistan? I said, yes. He said, no, buy at Hafiz Center. That's a much better place to buy it. I said, fine. We used to get lovely computers. Now they've finally cracked down on cell phones and computers. So now there are huge tariff barriers. So every phone now costs a huge amount. So last time I went to Hafiz Center to buy a computer, guess what? They're importing consumers in garbage consignments, or these secondhand, what they call Landa consignments. They're importing used computers, 10-year-old in consignments, and selling them. So every kid now has to buy a used computer, right? Which is Xeon or whatever, old chips and old computers. They dust them up, and it's okay, now you can have this for 20,000, 30,000, 50,000, something like that. They sell you those computers. I don't know whether we're going to gain from this or not when our kids who are supposed to be competing in the IT market are using cheap computers. At the same time, our internet is down. At the same time, our cell phones, now everybody being forced to buy cheap Pakistani cell phones. Apple is out of the reach of everybody. Even good Samsung is out of the reach of everybody. So I don't know how this will affect the IT industry. This is the point of complexity. You affect something here, something else gets affected. So it is not that I'm for free market, but I just begin to understand the complexity of the system. And I say, hey, there's no grand computer. I remember when I went to Czechoslovakia for the reform, I asked them about prices, and they said that tomorrow we'll have a meeting. Next day I went there, they were carting in a bunch. They had a huge truckload of computer paper there. Here's the economy, let's discuss it. I said, shit, you got a whole computer printout. I mean, truckload of computer printout. How the hell do you keep track of it? They say, oh, well, we watch everything. So you can't do it that way. So that's a problem. The second thing is, Gonzalo, I mean, you know, everybody talks about consultation. It's the private sector, the government. And yes, the private sector, Bashir Saab and my son Malik, they sit with the government often. Academia has no role in this. Now you mentioned 15 million and $10 million. Guess what the budget of PIDE is? $1 million, right? And the private sector will not even talk to us, right? Because quite frankly, there's no relationship between industry and the private sector. This relationship somehow cannot be created unless they feel the need. There's no relationship between us and the government too, because neither of them feel the need to consult the local academia because technical assistance is there. I think there's a huge crowding out. We talk about crowding out of investment. Nobody talks about crowding out of intellect. And I think that's also important to think about. If you think the reform is going to be created by ideas, which I think, which I've written in my book too, then we have to let the domestic idea industry happen. If we don't let the domestic idea industry happen, then reform is kind of half-winged, because there are no ideas that are floating around domestically. World Bank comes in and says something, or DFID comes in and says something. People don't really pay attention because, you know, there's no reform happening. Besides, who takes responsibility for that advice? For example, when the IPP happened, who was responsible? Were we responsible? For example, when the the fund program came in, I was there when the regulatory duties were put in. I sat there and I argued, hey, regulatory duties are ridiculous. Why are we doing that? Who is responsible then? And when Michael Barber came in, did the education reform and nothing happened, who is responsible? So these are all issues that we should also worry about. I'm not trying to, point any fingers, but these are important fingers to point, because where is the domestic debate? How do we get our policy making going? Anyway, that's for another time. Thank you very much, folks. This has been a wonderful session. Enjoyed it enormously. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.